to interrupt your conversations, but we are going to start our second talk, and after that's done, you can converse as much as you like. But until then, please help me give a warm welcome to Mr. Garret Meier.
What's going on, everybody? I'm going to try and use the mic so I don't have to like yell. I'm not as good at being loud as our other friends here. So, cool. Yeah, well, I'm going to talk for a little while about effectively using promises in Node along with async await and how you can start doing that like literally right this second, or maybe not right this second, but like 15 or 20 minutes, something like that. But yeah, my name is Garret. I'm a software engineer here at Mixmax. You can find my tweets or email me if that's the kind of thing you want to do. All right, so to start off with like a quick outline of where we're going to be going in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some outcomes because I think everybody can probably get something from this talk, or at least I hope so. Then I'm going to go into why we should be using promises or in async await, some reasons for doing that, and how you can start using it now, some reasons why you might not want to use promises right now if you work in like an existing code base, and how we can actually solve those. And then a few tools that we like to use at Mixmax and we've seen used elsewhere to use async await effectively in Node for maybe some like more advanced use cases. Awesome. So some quick outcomes, but before we do that, quick poll. Who's familiar with like callbacks in Node? Just an idea. Awesome. What about like promises? Who's used promises? Cool. And then async await? Awesome. We got a good variety, a little less on the end. Hopefully everyone has a little bit of experience throughout. I think there's something for everybody here. So, a few outcomes are, number one, you can stop writing any new Node code using callbacks. I swear you can do that now, regardless of your code base. If you can't, you should definitely talk to me afterwards because I'm curious. Then using some new features and supporting old versions, because sometimes backwards compatibility is important. That's another thing I think we can learn from this talk. And then also some more advanced use cases like I talked about, doing some high throughput operations using promises and async await to sort of simplify your code a little bit. And then we can be all as happy as Aziz is here. Cool, so why should you use promises? Since most people are familiar, we can kind of go through pretty quickly with this, but right here is a pretty familiar pattern for just using callbacks. They were okay for a while, but then they were not okay. Then you try and use you try and do a bunch of asynchronous stuff in a list, and then afterward you want to use the results, and you end up having to just keep nesting down. We're all in callback hell. That's not where we want to be. We end up having to write a lot of extra instrumentation code to use these callbacks correctly. Don't know where we're at. It's just bad news all around. So then we had promises. Promises help us manage that complexity. Right here, just returning a promise. It simplifies that code. It's still a little bit of boilerplate. You have to create the promise. You have to handle it, resolve it, reject it, do all those different things. You still see the callbacks. You still have the flashbacks to using callbacks because they're still there. They're not really that hidden. But it was better. We could do things like promise.all and actually know when all of our items were done, when all of our asynchronous calls were finished. That's really great. It helps us manage the nesting. We don't have to nest 3 layers deep and do counters in order to figure out when we're done with stuff. That is awesome. But again, still some boilerplate. We still have to have all these thens, and you can end up having to remember when you return a promise from different functions, which functions return a promise, how you're going to handle those specific functions. It's a little bit annoying, and it can still be a lot of overhead to remember as you're developing. So async await is even better. We can use the exact same function that I had earlier, and that just returns a promise like we had, but we can just await on all of those promises. And then handle the results afterward. We don't have to do then. We can write a try-catch right around this function. We don't have to make sure that we return a promise. It's pretty clear from the async keyword that we're returning a promise, kind of those indicators there. As a result, it's a lot better to use async await than to be using promises, or especially callbacks. We can avoid all of that needless nesting and just write more clear, readable code. Less opportunity to code ourselves into a corner. Cool. So moving on, now that we all want to start using async await and promises in Node, how can we start doing that right now? Well, there are a few reasons why we might not, and that's why David Tennant is really sad, because we may not want to do that. The three that we found at Mixmax when we were trying to do this, and I think are pretty common, are number one, I think, and like hardest, is trying to do a big bang migration is pretty risky. So if you have an existing code base that is using callbacks and that is using Node 6 or something like that, it's pretty risky to just spend like a day, a week, a month, like upgrading your entire code base to use promises to like kind of rip all that out. It can be super painful, and even if you're super diligent about writing tests, you probably have to rewrite a lot of your tests, and then maybe those tests are now wrong. So it's just a super high risk and high effort task to try and migrate everything all at once. And it might seem like you have to do that with promises, or less you have to like wrap everything in promises like we saw earlier, which kind of sucks. Also, backwards compatibility. Maybe you don't want to use async and await because you have to support older versions of Node, and you don't want to break people but still allow people to use your API, even if you want to use async and await. And finally, maybe you have some dependencies that are callback only, and so you think that you can't escape callback hell quite that all the way because you still have to wrap them in something or handle them in some way. Those are all reasons why you might not want to do it. You might still be using callbacks because of those reasons, but they can be solved. Eventually, David Tennant will be happy. The way to solve the first two bullet points is using a bit of transpilation to allow you to migrate incrementally, support old versions, but still write new code. So we have used transform async to generator plugin for Babel to translate our 7.6 code into a pre-7.6 build. So we can write async and await in our code, but then have a build that's compatible with non-asynchronous or non-async await code, which is really nice for when we have to use submodules in different Node environments. We don't know what they are. We have to support older environments. As long as it has generators, which I think is in 6 or something, it'll be okay. And you can probably transpile to older versions than that. So how does that look? Well, it's pretty simple. On one side, you can just write this. You can write your async function. It's right behind me. You can export it pretty easy. And then on the other side, you have the generated code, the built code that has like, all this is auto-generated, so you don't really have to worry about it, but it just sort of wraps it in a generator and handles the asynchronous stuff using yield, which is really nice because we can write all this clean async and await code using promises and then just have it be usable in pre-Node 7.6 environments. Really nice. And I have some examples that I'll share at the end on a gist if you're interested in like looking at specifics. But then in your module, you can write like a little file that distinguishes which Node version you're on, and then depending on that Node version, can either use the build files or your existing files that you're writing in Node 7.6. We might as well use the keywords if they're there. Cool. So yeah, that helps us not have to do a big bang migration. It helps us not have to migrate everything at once because we can still be backward compatible with our APIs. We can write all our new code using promises and using async and await without having to completely modify anything that depends on that code. We can still add a bunch of new features without having to upgrade the environment that we're running all of our code in. But we still have one more left, and that's why David Tennant is still sad. We have callback-only dependencies, and so we have to write a lot of boilerplate, right? Well, that's definitely one option. There's one option to handle these callback-only dependencies, and that's just to like wrap them. Kind of like we were doing before with the request module. It's just passing in, or just creating a new promise and returning that, kind of wrapping all of our functions. That's fine, but if you end up having to do that a lot, it's no fun. It's just no fun at all. We use a module called promise-callbacks that has a few super useful functions. One is the deferred function that you call it. It returns a promise, and you can pass that promise in as a callback and await on the result. So this function actually just returns a promise. We could await on this promise variable here. So it's really nice for like one-off functions. It's a good replacement for this boilerplate here. Just a couple of lines, and it's a little bit easier. You don't have to like manually handle your error. It will handle it all and turn it into essentially a promise API for you. But maybe you have an entire set of functions that all need to be promise-ified. And so there's another function for that in promise-callbacks, where maybe we have this API that takes a bunch of callbacks. We can promise-ify it all just by passing in the API object. It's a little bit more of a blunt tool there, but then we can just take the result and call it, and we return a promise just like anything else. So it just wraps them in essentially that promise, that deferred, or that deferred thing I was showing earlier, and returns that. So once again, it takes us from a callback API into promised land, where we want to be, where we can use async and await. Cool. All right, so now we're like relatively pleased. We can use promises now. There are obviously no reasons why we wouldn't, because we've checked those 3 boxes off. Cool, so what are some interesting tools and techniques for using promises? One that I've seen, and I hadn't this in an example earlier, but it's so simple that it's really nice to think about and take advantage of. You can use promise.all and array.map for like a really simple way to await on a bunch of parallel actions. So we go through an entire list, we do something with the result of that list that's asynchronous, and we can just await on all of those promises and do something afterward. This is super useful. It's a really concise way of writing what previously was very long code. You had to, like I said, add in a bunch of extra counters and extra functions. It's not nested at all, or it's hardly nested at all. It's really easy to read and maintain. These are all great things that we can gain from using promises. And this is like a nice little pattern that you can use as you going about writing async await. But sometimes you have a list and you don't know how long it is. It could just be of arbitrary length. Maybe it's 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 elements long. And so what you want to do is you want to handle high volume requests without stressing your resources or increasing your memory a lot by having just a ton of awaiting promises. So there's a library called promise-pool that handles that for you. So you can iterate over a list using a for loop. I think there's a proposal for an upcoming for async loop that would actually make this a little bit easier. We can use a for loop and we can await on starting an asynchronous function inside this loop, and we'll only start the integer that we have inside promise pool, we'll only start that number of promises at once. So it's really nice for if we have maybe a downstream resource that we don't want to stress with 100,000 requests all at once. Or if we have the flexibility to do things in batches. So this lets us start 10 and then wait until we're ready to start the 11th and then the 12th, etc. And then we can just await on flushing everything from the pool and go on about our business. This is a really nice way to handle, like I said, high volume requests and kind of limit the memory usage if you're worried about that, or if you have lists of arbitrary length. That's another great option. But maybe you're making some database calls, maybe you're using some cursors. There's another great tool and pattern for handling that, because we probably don't want to return an arbitrary number of results from our database all at once, and then run asynchronous code on that. So let's just say we have this super simple iterator that gets something. We can use the promise-iterate function from the promise-iterate library in order to allow that cursor to manage its own resources and then run asynchronous requests on top of that. And we can just await for all the results to be done until the cursor is done, and then again go on about our business. Once again, this is super simple code. A good use case for this is if maybe you're requesting a ton of documents, you need to request all of your users and run a migration or something like that. This is a great way to iterate over them, so we're not requesting a ton of information from our database all at once. We're requesting it maybe in batches of 50, or whatever the cursor is configured to, and then the cursor will just run them one by one asynchronously, and we can just await until it's done. Really simple, super straightforward to just run this. You just pass in the cursor and then pass in the function that you want to run on the cursor, and then it just returns a promise that you can await on. Some really great tools for handling everything from really simple use cases where you just have a little list, and you can use promise.all, or varying lengths of lists, or varying different constraints depending on what your use case is. Cool. So if you're interested in seeing some examples of that code, you can head to that link. Mostly all the code that I have there with a few comments is their async await migration script. If you want, you can almost just like port that right into whatever module you're supporting. With a few modifications, there's some examples of promise pool, promise-iterate, promise-callbacks all throughout. And yeah, just to review, hopefully now you can never write a callback again. You can use async await and still support older versions of Node that don't support async await. And maybe you can use some of these awesome libraries that handle all of the like high volume operations for you that can manage your threads, manage your use of asynchronous calls. Cool. With that, are there any questions? Also, the only pitch we have all night is we are hiring. If you want to work on sweet promise patterns like these, contribute to open source, definitely come talk to anyone in the Mixmax shirt after this. So yeah, awesome. Thanks everybody. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so with the generated code in our source maps, it does use the generated code in the source maps, but this transpilation is actually literally all it does is insert one function at the top of the file and then wrap any async function in that function, and then instead of await, it uses the keyword yield. So it's actually still really readable. If there's a bug in that built code, you can like translate almost exactly to what that code is. Yeah, so that's a reason why we chose that specific plugin as opposed to any other combination, because it made it a lot more readable.
So you're using just this one?
Yeah, for these modules, yeah, because we're using this primarily for like our node specific submodules. These other stuff are like client side and things, but just this one. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you only need to do the transform for old versions of Node? Why not just upgrade to Node 9?
Yeah, I mean, right. So yeah, if you can, definitely. But there are we have some reasons why we can't with like an old. There's some old reasons why we can't basically, and we have to transpile back to Node 6. So that, I guess, if you can upgrade, definitely do, and then you don't even have to do that part. But the other reason to do it is if maybe you don't want to break people who are using Node 6, if you're maintaining like a module. But yeah, if you're writing your own service, just use Node 9, and that you can ignore that whole part. Yeah.
So one of the things about promises versus callbacks, I know callbacks are all old school and whatnot, but they are very fast. Are you seeing any to much performance issues going to pure promises versus a pure callback stack?
We haven't seen, we've been running like almost all the stuff that I've been talking about in production for a month or so, and we haven't seen any noticeable performance decrease because of it. So I know that there is, like in the benchmarks, there are differences, but we haven't seen any in just like running it in our normal production code, so hasn't been a problem yet. Yeah.
Do you know if the standard Node libraries are going to be shipped with promise support at some point, so we don't have to happen?
If you need help, I can help. So in Node, things like FS, right? They don't have a promise version. But there is this great helper function called util.promisify that did land, is part of Node 8, is part of Node 9, that will let you do similar things to some of the libraries we saw to wrap callback-based functions to turn them into promises so that you can benefit from async awaits and get awesomeness in your code. As far as promises in Node core, I'm going to...
You should look at pull request 15485, which is an initial experimental implementation of a promise-ified FS core module, and you can sort of get a feel from the comments as to how likely it is that this is something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Pretty good comment, Jane.
Yeah, short-term, Google util.promisify.
Yeah, util.promisify.
Long-term, hop on the chain.
And there's also util.callbackify if you need that.
That's just weird.
Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.